16-bit arcade graphics.
You can't do this on Nintendo. Genesis does.
16-bit sports action.
You can't do this on Nintendo. Genesis
Does.
Genesis
Does.
Genesis
Does.
Genesis
Does.
Genesis does.
Get Joe Montana free, Pat Riley free, Buster Douglas free, Super Monaco GP free, or Columns free.
Genesis does.
What Nintendo don't? Buy a 16-bit Genesis system between now and October 31st and get an extra game.
Hey Slayers, and that commercial you just saw was the commercial for the Sega Genesis, and arguably the Sega's most popular commercial of all time. So I hope you like the changes to the new Sega history format, because this time we're going to be having gameplay instead of just pictures. But without further ado, let's just get into this, because this is my second time recording this, and I really don't want to record it a second time. The Sega Genesis, known as the Mega Drive outside North America, is a 16-bit fourth-generation home video game console developed and sold by Sega. The Genesis is Sega's third console and the successor to the Master System. Sega released it as the Mega Drive in Japan in 1988 and later as the Genesis in North America in 1989. In 1990, it was distributed as the Mega Drive by Virgin Mastertronics in Europe, OZSoft in Australia, and Tectoy in Brazil. In South Korea, it was distributed by Samsung as the Super Game Boy and later Super Aladdin Boy. Designed by an R&D team, hold on, we're just going to skip that. We're going to go straight up into history and development. In the early 1980s, Sega Enterprises Inc., then a subsidiary of Gulf and Western, was one of the top 5 arcade manufacturers active in the United States as the company revenues surpassed $200 million between July 1981 and June 1982. A downturn in the arcade business starting in 1982 seriously hurt the company, leading Gulf and Western to sell its North American arcade manufacturing organization and licensing the rights for its arcade game to Bally Manufacturing. The company retained Sega North American R&D operations as well as its Japanese subsidiary Sega Enterprises, which, with its arcade business in decline, Sega Enterprises president Hayao Nakayama advocated that the company leverage its hardware expertise to move into the home console market in Japan, which was in its infancy at the time. Nakayama received permission to proceed with this project, leading to the release of Sega's first home video game console, the SG-1000, in July 1983. While it had sold 160,000 units in Japan, far exceeding Sega's expectations, sales at store were dominated by Nintendo's Famicom, which had been released the same day. Sega estimated that the Famicom outsold the SG-1000 by a 10-to-1 margin. The SG-1000 was replaced by the Mark III within 2 years. In the meantime, Gulf and Western began to divest itself of its non-core businesses after the death of company founder Charles Blunden. So Nakayama and former Sega CEO David Rosen arranged a management buyout of the Japanese subsidiary in 1984 with financial backing from CSX Corporation, a prominent Japanese software company. Nakayama was then installed as CEO of Sega Enterprises. In 1986, Sega redesigned the Mark III for release in North America as the Master System. This was followed by a European release the next year. Although the Master System was a success in Europe and later in Brazil, it failed to ignite significant interest in the Japanese or North American markets, which by the mid to late 80s were both dominated by Nintendo. With Sega continuing to have difficulties penetrating the home market, Sega's console R&D team, led by Masami Ishikawa and supervised by Hideki Sato, began work on a successor to the Master System almost immediately after that console launched. In 1980, Sega faced another threat to its console business when Japanese computer giant NEC released the PC Engine amid great publicity to remain competitive against the two more established consumer electronic companies. Ishikawa and his team decided they needed to incorporate a 16-bit microprocessor into their new system to make an impact in the marketplace, and once again turned to Sega's strength in the arcade industry to adapt the successful Sega 16 arcade board into the architecture for a home console. The decision to use a Motorola 68000 as the system's main CPU was made later in development, while a Zilog Z80 was used as a secondary CPU to handle the sound due to fears that the load to the main CPU would be too great if it handled both the visuals and audio. The 68000 chip was expensive and would have driven the retail price of the console up greatly, but Sega was able to negotiate with the distributor for the tenth of its price on an upfront volume order, with the promise of more orders pending the console's future success. The appearance of the Mega Drive was designed by a team led by Mitsugi Shirawa, I think that's it. I don't know how to say his name, so we just call him MS. That drew inspiration from audiophile equipment and automobiles. Shirawa said this more mature look helped to target the Mega Drive to all ages, unlike the Famicom, which was it aimed primarily at children. According to Sato, the Japanese design for the Mega Drive was based on an appearance of an audio player and presents the text 16-bit embossed in a golden metallic banner to give the impression of power. First announced in June 1988, issue of Japanese gaming magazine Beep that the developing console was initially called the Mark V, but Sega management wanted a stronger name. After reviewing more than 3,000 proposals, the company settled on Mega Drive. In North America, the name of the company was changed to Genesis. The reason for this change is not known, but it may have been due to a trademark dispute. Sato stated that some design aesthetics had to change, such as the gold-colored 16-bit wording, because it was believed that the color would be mistaken for yellow. He believes that the changes in design are representative of the differences in values between Japanese and American culture. Sega released the Mega Drive in Japan on October 29, 1988, though the launch was overshadowed by Nintendo's release of Super Mario Bros. 3 a week earlier. Positive coverage from magazines Famitsu and Beep helped to establish a following, but Sega only managed to ship 400,000 units in the first year. In order to increase sales, Sega released various peripherals and games, including an online banking system, an answering machine called the Sega Mega Answer. Nevertheless, the Mega Drive was unable to overtake variable Famicom. Why is it called that? It's literally just Famicom, and remained a distant third in Japan behind Nintendo's Super Famicom and NEC's PC Engine throughout the 16-bit era. Sega announced a North American release date for the system on January 9, 1989. At the time, Sega did not possess North American sales and marketing organizations and was distributing its master system through Tonka. Dissatisfied with Tonka's performance, Sega looked for a new partner to market the Genesis in North America and offered the rights to Atari Corporation, which did not yet have a 16-bit system. David Rosen made the proposal to Atari CEO Jack Tramiel and the president of Atari's Entertainment Electronics division, Michael Katz. Tramiel declined to acquire the new console, deeming it too expensive, and instead opted to focus on the Atari ST. Sega decided to launch the console through its own Sega of America subsidiary, which executed a limited launch on August 14, 1989 in New York City and Los Angeles. The Genesis was released in the rest of North America that year. The European version was released in September 1990 at a price of $189. The release was handled by Virgin Mastertronic, which was later purchased by Sega in 1991 and became Sega of Europe. Games like Space Harrier 2, Ghouls and Ghosts, Golden Axe, Super Thunderblade, and The Revenge of Shinobi were available in stores at launch. The console was also bundled with Altered Beast. The Mega Drive and its first batch of games were shown at the 1990 European Computer Entertainment Show, ECES, in Earl's Court between July and August 1990. Virgin initially placed their order for 20,000 Mega Drive units. However, the company increased the order by 10,000 units when advanced orders had exceeded expectations, and another 10,000 units was later added following the console's success at the ECES event, the projected number of units to be sold between September and December 1990 had eventually increased to 40,000 units in the United Kingdom alone. Other companies assisted in distributing the console to various countries worldwide. Ubisoft handled the Mega Drive's launch and marketing in Australia, as it had done before with the Master System. In Brazil, the Mega Drive was released by Tectoy in 1990. Only a year after the Brazilian release of the Sega Master System, Tectoy produced games exclusively for the Brazilian market and brought the Sega MegaNet online service there in 1994 and 1995. In India, Sega entered a distribution deal with Shaw Wireless in the spring of 1995 in order to circumvent an 80% import tariff, with each unit selling for 18,000 rupees. Samsung handled sales and distribution in Korea, where it was named Super Game Boy and retained the Mega Drive logo alongside the Samsung name. It was later renamed Super Aladdin Boy. North American sales and marketing. North American sales and marketing. For the North American market, former Atari Corporation Entertainment Electronics Division President and new Sega of America CEO Michael Katz, and I'll get to him one day when I cover him because he's not a good CEO, Tom Kalinske. It's distributed a two-part approach to build sales in the region. The first part involved a marketing campaign to challenge Nintendo head-on and emphasize the more arcade-like experience available on the Genesis. Summarized by slogans including Genesis does what Nintendo don't, which you know because you just saw the commercial. Since Nintendo owned the console rights to most arcade games of the time, the second part involved creating a library of instantly recognizable games which used names and likenesses of celebrities and athletes such as Pat Riley, basketball, Arnold Palmer, tournament golf, James Buster Douglas, knockout boxing, Joe Montana, football, Tommy Lasorda, basketball, Mario Lemieux, hockey, and Michael Jackson's moonwalker. Nonetheless, it had a hard time overcoming Nintendo's ubiquitous presence in consumer homes. Tasked by Nakayama to sell 1 million units within the first year, Katz and Sega of America managed to sell only 500,000 units. In the mid-1990s, Nakayama hired Tom Kalinske to replace Katz as the CEO of Sega of America. Although Kalinske initially knew little about the video game market, he surrounded himself with industry-savvy advisors. A believer in the razor and blades business model, he developed a 4-point plan: cut the price of the console, created a US-based team to develop games targeted at the American market, continue and expand the aggressive advertising campaign, and replace the bundled game Altered Beast with a new game, Sonic the Hedgehog. The Japanese board of directors initially disapproved of the plan, but all 4 points were approved by Nakayama, who told Kalinske, "I hired you to make the decisions for Europe and the Americas. So go ahead and do it." Magazines praised Sonic as one of the greatest games yet made, and Sega's console finally took off as the consumers who had been waiting for the release of the international version of Nintendo Super Famicom, the Super Nintendo Entertainment System, and the SNES decided to purchase a Genesis instead. Nintendo's console debated against an established computer, while NEC's TurboGrafx 16 failed to gain traction, and NEC soon pulled out of the market. In large part due to the popularity of Sonic the Hedgehog, the Genesis outsold the SNES in the United States nearly 2-1 during the 1991 holiday seasons. This success led to Sega having control of 65% of the 16-bit console market in January 1992, making it the first time Nintendo was not the console leader since December 1985. To compete with Nintendo, Sega was more open to new types of games than its rival, but still tightly controlled the approach processes for third-party games and changed high prices for cartridge manufacturing. Technicalities. From America, third-party video game publishers Electronic Arts (EA), which were actually good at the time, reverse engineered the Genesis in 1989. Never mind, they weren't good. Following nearly 1 year of negotiations with Sega, in which EA requested a more reliable liberal licensing agreement then was standard in the industry. Before releasing its games for the system, the clean room reverse engineering was led by Steve Hayes and Jim Nichols. With this information, one day prior to the 1990 Consumer Electronics Show (CES, noting that EA had the ability to run its own licensing program if Sega refused to meet its demands, Sega relented, and the next day EA's upcoming Genesis games were showcased at CES. EA signed what Hawkins described as a very unusual and much more enlightened licensing agreement with Sega in June 1990. Among other things, we had the right to make as many titles as we wanted. We could approve our own titles. The royalty rates were a lot more reasonable. We also had more direct control over manufacturing. After the deal was in place, EA Chief Creative Officer Ben Gordon learned that we hadn't figured out all the workarounds, and Sega still had the ability to lock us out. Noting it just would have been a public relations fiasco. EA released its first two Genesis games, Populous and Budokan, the Martell Spirit, within the month. The first Genesis versions of EA's John Madden's Football arrived before the end of 1990 and became what Gordon called a killer app for the system. Taking advantage of the licensing agreement, Gordon and EA's Vice President of Marketing Services, Nancy Fong, created a visual identifier for EA's Genesis cartridges, a yellow stripe on their left side added during manufacturing. Sega was able to outsell Nintendo 4 Christmas seasons in a row due to Genesis having a 2-year lead, a lower price point, and a larger library of games compared to the SNES at its release. Sega had 10 games for every game on SNES, and while the SNES had an exclusive version of Final Fight, one of Sega's internal development teams created Streets of Rage, which had bigger levels, tougher enemies, and a well-regarded soundtrack. ASCII Entertainment reported in early 1993 that the Genesis had 250 games versus 75 for the SNES, but limited shelf space meant that stores typically offered 100 Genesis and 50 SNES games. The NES was still the leader with 300 games and 100 on shelves. Sega's advertising positioned the Genesis as the cooler console, and as its advertising evolved, the company coined the term blast processing, which I will show you at the end of this video, an obscure and unutilized programming trick on the graphics hardware to suggest that its processing capabilities were far greater than the SNES. A Sony focus group found that teenage boys would not admit to owning an SNES rather than a Genesis, with the Genesis often outselling the SNES a ratio to 2-1. Sorry for the weird audio cut there. At a ratio of 2-1. Nintendo and Sega both focused heavily on impression management of the market, even going to the point of deception, with Nintendo claiming it had sold more consoles in 1991 than it actually had, and forecasting it would sell 6 million consoles by the end of 1992, while its actual U.S. install base at the end of 1992 was only just more than 4 million units. Due to these tactics, it was difficult to ascertain a clear leader in market share for several years at a time, with 1993 Sega claiming 55% of the 16-bit hardware sales during 1994, and Donkey Kong Country helping the SNES to outsell the Genesis from 1995 through 1997. According to a 2004 study of NPD sales, the Genesis was able to maintain its lead over the Super NES in America 16-bit console market. However, according to a 2014 study, Wedbush Securities reported, based on the revised NPD sales date, the SNES outsold the Genesis in the U.S. market. So it's pretty much a conscription, but I believe the Genesis outsold the SNES. But anyway, that's the end of this video. I'm going to show you I'm going to show you 2 more Sega commercials, which would probably be the Welcome to the Next Level commercial and the Blast Processing commercial. But I do hope you enjoyed. Until next week when we cover the Sega CD and Sega 32X. See you, Slayers.
Gotta go.
Hey, guy, you're the first serious gamer I've seen all morning. Check this out. Brand new 16-bit Super Nintendo with Super Mario World. Wow!
What's this one?
Oh, this is a Sonic the Hedgehog from Sega Genesis. Hey, look at these radical colors, huh?
Wow, Sonic's fast, too.
No, over here.
I like Genesis, and it costs a lot less.
Wait, kid, that game
I'll
there.
take Sonic and Genesis.
I knew that.
Sonic the Hedgehog. More action, more speed. Sega Genesis, it's a whole lot more for less.
The Sega Genesis has blast processing. Super Nintendo doesn't. So what's blast processing do? And what if you don't have blast processing?
Sega!